Chicago, winter of 1950. The kind of winter that didn't just sting your skin, but clawed into your bones like the ghosts you never buried. The kind of cold that made men like me disappear behind coats that still smelled faintly of fire, of steel, of the silence that followed distant shelling. I stood just outside Union Station most mornings, under the broken glow of a flickering street lamp, playing my guitar for people too busy, too tired, or too hurt to listen. And that suited me fine, because I wasn't playing for them. I played to keep warm, to keep my hands moving, to keep the noise inside me from getting too loud. And though I played with my body hunched, my face down, and my notes barely whole, the music came out shaped like prayers I didn't have the words for anymore. I wasn't trying to be heard, I was trying to survive. I wasn't chasing applause or redemption, just enough coins for coffee, a bowl of soup, maybe one warm night where the wind didn't find its way into my ribs. No one knew my name, and I made sure of that. Because the man I had been, the one who marched through France with a rifle and a photograph in his pocket, had never made it back home, not really. He died somewhere in the mud outside Metz, where the ground shook beneath our boots and the sky was too dark to see your own fear. What came back was a shadow, a man with a broken voice and a guitar he could barely afford to carry. I slept in a shelter for veterans down by the river, a building that creaked when the wind hit it just right, where the beds were stiff, the coffee weak, and the silence between men was heavier than their packs had ever been. We never asked about each other's wars. We just recognized the weight in the way someone sat, the far-off look when someone stirred in their sleep, the way a man's hands trembled over nothing. Inside my guitar case, old, scratched and lined with a fabric that still held the scent of wet wool, I kept one thing hidden, tucked beneath a false bottom I'd built myself, a letter I hadn't read in 5 years. It was from Clara, the girl I had promised to write, the one who kissed me goodbye at the train station in Akron before I shipped out, whose words had followed me across oceans and blood-soaked fields until I could no longer bear to read them. That final letter, unopened, unread, untouched, was dated March 1945. I knew, without needing to see the words, that she was telling me she was pregnant, that she had named the boy David, if it was a boy, that she still believed I'd come home, that she was waiting. But I never answered. I couldn't. By the time it arrived, I was lying in a veterans' hospital, silent and paralyzed, half of me numb, all of me gone, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to imagine a world where someone still loved me enough to write. So I buried that letter in my case and buried myself in the city. And then one morning everything changed. A little girl, maybe 7, maybe 8, in a red wool scarf stood quietly nearby, watching me play the way only children can, with more heart than reason. She had been there before, always silent, always still, and I never asked why, because asking meant opening something I'd kept locked up for too long. As I strummed a slow, fractured melody, something between a lullaby and a lament, she stepped forward with a coin in her hand, the kind of small gesture I usually received without thought. But this time, the coin slipped from her fingers, struck the sidewalk, rolled forward, and clicked against the latch of my case. The lock snapped open. The false bottom shifted. And there, in the cold morning air, the letter slipped into view like a ghost I thought I'd outrun. She reached in before I could move, held it up, looked at me. And in that single moment, with the sound of traffic behind us and the guitar silent at my feet, I realized the war had found me again, not with bullets, but with truth. If this story moves you, like it moved me to write it, leave a like and subscribe. It helps us keep telling stories that touch, heal, and surprise. And now, prepare yourself, because what comes next will change everything. I slept in a veterans' shelter just off the river, near an old warehouse in a part of Chicago that time and pride had long since abandoned. A neighborhood full of other men like me, each one walking the edge between memory and survival, between the life we lived before the war and the one we were still trying to rebuild without a map, without a voice, without a welcome. The building creaked when the wind howled through its broken window panes, and the beds were stiff and damp, lined up in rows like hospital cots, each one holding a man who no longer dreamed. Most nights, I exchanged a song or two for a bowl of soup or a place closer to the radiator. And though the soup was thin and the silence in that place thicker than any winter coat, I stayed, because it was the only place that didn't ask questions. No one wanted your story there. Everyone had one, and all of them sounded the same after a while. A beach, a rifle, a scream, a letter that never came back. In the daylight hours, I wandered back toward Union Station. The same cracked sidewalks beneath my boots, the same soot-covered skyline above. The city had rebuilt after the war. New towers, cleaner streets, flags in every window, but I hadn't. I still wore the same long wool coat from '44, the one with the lining torn, where I had stitched the inside pocket by hand to hide the letter I couldn't destroy and couldn't face. I still kept the guitar slung across my back, a weight heavier than it looked, because it didn't just carry wood and string, it carried everything I couldn't say. I played for strangers, for office workers, factory men, secretaries with tired eyes and nowhere to go but forward. They didn't stop. They didn't look. They dropped coins like they were brushing crumbs off a table. And I thanked them without speaking, because I had nothing worth saying. My music wasn't cheerful. It didn't dance or lift hearts. It crept out like fog, low and unsure, shaped by regret more than rhythm, melody soaked in memory and muted pain. Each note I played was a confession I never dared voice. The chords wrapped around images I couldn't erase. Snow falling on a foxhole, blood steaming in a field hospital, the sound of someone calling their mother and getting only sky in return. Sometimes I played songs I used to know, old folk tunes from back home, the kind my father sang while fixing fences on the farm in Ohio. Other times, I made up melodies right there on the spot, letting my fingers tell the story my mouth had long since forgotten how to speak. People didn't notice, but one girl did. She showed up every few days, maybe 7, maybe 8 years old, always bundled in a red wool scarf that looked too big for her frame, always quiet, always standing a little too close, like she was listening for something no one else could hear. She never spoke, never smiled, but her eyes followed my fingers with the kind of focus you only see in children and ghosts. I never asked where she came from or why she kept coming back, because I didn't want to know. Some things you let be, some things you don't touch. But I started to play differently when she was near, slower, softer. Not because I wanted to impress her, but because something about her gaze made me feel like the music mattered again, like it was being heard, not just tolerated. I found myself pulling out melodies I hadn't touched in years, ones I used to hum in the barracks, ones I had whistled on the train heading west, ones I had half written for Clara before I left and never dared to finish. And always, I wondered if Clara had ever passed by, if she had seen me without recognizing me, or worse, recognized me and walked away. I imagined her holding David's hand, if he was alive, and stopping for a second to listen, puzzled by something in the way I played, something she couldn't place but couldn't quite let go of either. That thought stayed with me through the coldest mornings and the longest nights. It became the rhythm beneath everything I played, the question that never stopped echoing. Would she forgive me if she knew? Could she? Sometimes I closed my eyes while playing, letting my hands find their way across the strings by memory alone. In that darkness, I could see her. Clara, not as she might be now, older and hardened, but as she had been, waiting for me on the station platform with her hands wrapped in gloves, her eyes shining with belief. I could see her lips moving as if reciting my name, as if trying to send it out into the air, hoping it would reach me through fog and gunfire. And in those moments, I wasn't just a busker on a cold sidewalk. I wasn't just another broken man playing broken songs. I was someone who had been loved, someone who had meant something, someone who had a name once. I walked the cracked sidewalks, leading away from the veterans' shelter, just as the dim morning light made the city look like a memory chipped away by cold, carrying my guitar case the way a wounded man carries a promise, each step echoing with invisible weight from battles I never truly left behind, and secrets I couldn't speak aloud, secrets like the faded letter hidden beneath the false bottom of that case, written in Clara's careful script, her words sealed with hope, waiting for me to find the courage to read them. I had reached Union Station again, the air filled with smoke, steam, and the distant rumble of arriving trains, when the girl in the red scarf appeared, quiet, deliberate like a symbol I couldn't quite place. She moved between travelers and kept her gaze fixed on me as I played, and something about her presence drew the truth from my chest. My fingers trembled over the strings while I played a song born in a field hospital somewhere in France, a melody that felt more like grief than music. And as I prepared to slide into the next chord, I watched her hand drop a coin. It slipped. The coin rolled forward and slapped into the guitar case so delicately that time seemed to pause. The latch gave way, the lid opened just wide enough, and there it was. The envelope that had been my burden and my sigh all these years, lying in plain sight like a ghost refusing to stay buried. I froze at that moment, half presumed invisible in a city that had forgotten what I looked like, yet fully exposed to history, to memory, to everything Clara wrote in her looped letters while I was dying piece by piece inside a VA hospital. She picked it up with small fingers that may have gripped it more gently than I ever had, her eyes widening behind the red scarf, studying me as if she read the letter in my expression before even looking at it. I couldn't speak. Words left scars I didn't know how to bear. Instead, I knelt on the chilly pavement, careful not to reach for it with trembling hands that no longer recognized kindness, and watched her hold that letter as though it was both a miracle and a wound. I recognized the handwriting instantly, especially the curl of the capital C in Clara, and I remembered that letter arriving at the hospital in the first thaw of spring, a season ironically full of both hope and regret, carrying news I didn't want to receive, that she was expecting, that she believed I would come home, that she even named him David, before knowing if he was a son or a daughter. Every word had pierced me more than any bullet, and I put the letter in a pocket. I sewed myself inside the case months later, where I thought no one would ever find it, not even me. But now it was there, in her hand, glowing against the grey sidewalk. The past laid bare between us in a single breathless moment. I realized then that the war had finally followed me home, not in mud or blood, but in memory, and that I couldn't even pretend to hide anymore. The world shook just a little after that. I must have whispered something. Did I even speak? Maybe not. Maybe I only looked. But she met my eyes, blinking behind damp lashes, and in that look lay a story I wasn't sure I had the strength to finish. She closed the letter softly, as if honoring something I had lost and something she didn't yet understand, but that she felt was real. I don't know how long we stood there, the city holding its breath around us. Eventually, I reached out, my touch tentative, careful not to shatter the fragile paper. It slid into my hand like a confession I never meant to make. I folded it back into its shape, less stiff, more alive, with corners softer than they used to be, and placed it gingerly back in the false bottom of the case, the envelope and I sharing the same space again, like two ghosts learning to coexist. She didn't leave right away. She stood by me as the trains moved in and out, her presence as quiet as a prayer I almost dared to say. And when she finally walked away, I watched her vanish into the crowd I used to be part of, wishing more than words that she knew what she had done, how she brought the war back to me in a way I couldn't outrun. That day, I didn't play again. Not for coins, not for warmth, not even for the ghosts who used to follow me on Broadway in Paris or Omaha Beach. I closed the case, let the strings hang silent, and sat down on the edge of the station steps, holding that letter like a shape I thought I remembered, feeling everything I had denied for years finally become real. And somehow, sanctified. In the flickering light of winter on the cracked pavement of Union Station, I understood that survival wasn't about keeping safe. Survival was about facing the truth, even when it's too late to change the past. Followed the little girl in the red scarf down a side street that ran behind Union Station, the sidewalk crumbling under our feet and streetlights flickering overhead like weary sentinels, guiding me toward a modest clapboard house set back behind a wrought iron fence, its porch light oozing a soft glow I hadn't seen in years, a glow that felt like both a welcome and a summons. In that moment, I felt the weight of every regiment marching through my memory, the briny wind of the English Channel, the metallic taste of rain after shells fell, the nightmare of separation, and realized that I hadn't walked toward this house because I recognized the building, but because something in my chest pulled me, as though that yellowed envelope had stretched its fingers through time and led me here. She opened the gate quietly, her red scarf brushing against the cold breeze, and I watched as she slipped inside and knocked on the door with a single, deliberate tap. The echo of it traveled down my spine. A voice answered, soft, steady, familiar. The kind of voice that doesn't shout goodbye before leaving, but lets its absence echo in 100 unanswered letters. When the door swung open, there she was, Clara, older now, lines deeper around her eyes, her hair streaked with silver, both softer and stronger than I remembered. Standing there in silence, as if bracing herself for the ghost she knew was approaching. She didn't step back, didn't ridicule me, didn't ask me to prove I was who I claimed to be. She just looked. I wanted to speak. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I wanted to say I wish I'd loved you more, real than a memory. But my voice was trapped behind years of winter nights and empty beds. Instead, I swallowed all the words I'd planned and let the guitar case fall to my side with a quiet thud that sounded like the past coming home. Inside, she closed the door behind me, and the house felt both foreign and achingly familiar. Photographs on the walls, a small wooden table with chipped white paint, a floral wallpaper border curling at the ceiling. Everywhere I looked, stories had grown in my absence. David's drawings hung in simple frames, a sketch of a man and a woman holding hands. Written beneath was his name, bold and perfect in a child's handwriting, Daddy. I pressed my hand to my chest, where the letter still lay hidden, and felt everything tumble: regret, shame, love, hope. Clara didn't ask me if I'd read her letter. She didn't ask me where I'd been or why I hadn't come home. She just gestured to a chair near the window, where afternoon light pooled onto the floor, revealing motes of dust dancing like lost prayers. I sat. My guitar leaned against the wall by the doorway. Clara sat across from me, her gaze steady. For a long time, we just sat, two people tied by secrets and by silence. Then she stood up, disappeared into another room, and returned with a small, weathered frame. Inside was a photograph of a little boy with Clara's eyes and my smile, just half as big but the same, bleeding with nostalgia and loss. El jugué para él, I said in Spanish without meaning to, the words slipping out direct from memory. I played for him. Clara's eyes softened. She nodded, though the light in those eyes was prayerful, full of kindness I hadn't believed still existed. I reached for the guitar, my hands shaking as if they remembered courage. I tuned it slowly, each change a confession of what I'd lost and hoped to find. Clara stood beside me in silence, and I began to play a new melody, something that felt like the shape of forgiveness, something David would have hummed in the mornings before school, something Clara would have cradled in her heart while praying I'd return. Outside, the wind murmured through the fence. Inside, the music filled every empty corner of the room, knitted together the years I had run from, wove our breaths into a shared moment where time finally stopped punishing us. When I finished the last note, Clara smiled. Not a greeting or a welcome, but acknowledgement, and I let myself break. I didn't cry. Instead, I exhaled a breath I'd been holding since 1945. Clara placed a hand over mine. No questions, no demands, just quiet, wholly accepting presence. Her touch was forgiveness I never thought I deserved, but desperately needed. I packed my case again when I left, guitar across my back, letter still tucked inside, but the burden felt different. Now I was carrying a story, not a secret. The coin that fell, the latch that opened, it had undone the wall I built around my heart. And through that small opening, the music came pouring back. I stayed seated in that small living room long after the last chord faded, the guitar resting across my lap like a sacred relic, and I realized our silence had become the only conversation that mattered, because words would have shattered us like glass shards that never belonged to the present, and so we shared the pause instead, as if holding out a damaged piece of our past until it felt strong enough to survive. Clara sat beside me, the lamplight casting warm halos around her silhouette, and I watched her breathe, recognizing the faint tremor that could have been fear, regret, or a kind of quiet mercy I hadn't expected. And I longed to say something, anything, but could only press my palm to the body of the guitar as though it were stitched to my chest and spoke the history I could no longer hide. I wanted to apologize, and I wanted to say I never stopped loving you, and I wanted to explain why I stayed behind in places you could never find me, why my bones froze in battle and not in your arms, but the words stuck in my throat like cold stones. So instead I just hummed a melody, a fragile broken piece of music that Clara had taught me once. Or maybe it was something David sang when no one was listening, and my voice wavered, but Clara's hand found mine and squeezed, forgiving without speaking. Time drifted, and the world outside didn't go quiet. It rumbled with the noise of distant streetcars, the hum of unseen traffic, and the muffled chatter of neighbors in the quiet dusk. But inside that breathing room, the only sound was the rhythm of forgiveness, unfolding in a torsion of shared breath, until I felt the past loosen and the hope uncoil like a spring. When I finally lifted my head, Clara's eyes were still on me, no pity, no accusation, just presence, and I saw in that calm reflection the woman I once promised to return to, and the daughter we never truly lost, both layered in quiet resilience. And I realized then that the war might have stolen years of my life, but it could not steal this moment of recognition, of reconnection that no one else would understand. I closed the guitar case gently and placed my hand over the letter, feeling the paper's familiar weight, and I thought of how I had carried it like a grave for half a decade, not realizing it wanted to be carried like a story, not a burden. And as Clara's porch light drifted through the windows and traced the letters on the envelope, I decided there would be no more hiding. She stood suddenly and reached for the photograph of David again, holding it like a bridge between us, and I followed her lead, placing my hand over hers. For years, I'd been a ghost in my own life, haunting the streets of Chicago without a name, without a voice. But in that fragile clasp, I felt a pulse, a thrum of forgiveness that spoke louder than any confession I could ever make. I told her then, in a whisper that was too small to carry all the weight of what I meant, "I'm sorry I missed you," and her fingers stilled over mine as though my apology echoed inside her chest. And in her silence I heard 1,000 answers that meant more than any words could say. We stepped outside together as the night settled in, and the winter air felt less like a predator and more like a midnight witness, cool and wide and honest. I carried the guitar. She held David's frame, and we didn't need to carry anything else but the quiet between us, knotted with acknowledgement and release. When we reached the street, she paused and looked back at me, her breath puffing in the cold air, and offered a small smile, not the one I remembered, but something deeper, like a testament to survival that didn't require ceremony. I nodded, turning my face back to the empty station ahead, feeling lighter, strangely whole, and understood that forgiveness, spoken or not, can be enough to rebuild what trauma fractured. I went back to the station the next morning, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because something inside me needed to finish the song I had started all those years ago, a song that had no melody, only memory. And now, finally, a name. I stood in the same spot as before, where the wind curved around the buildings like a whisper, carrying the scent of winter and the hum of passing trains. And I opened my guitar case slowly, not to hide anything this time, but to let the story breathe. The letter lay on top now, no longer hidden beneath a false bottom, its edges curled with time, but no longer carrying shame. I placed it there on purpose, right where anyone could see, tucked beside a note I'd scribbled on a torn page of staff paper that read, "For Clara, for David, for all that was lost and found." I didn't need applause. I didn't even need coins. Every note I played now was different, warmer, fuller, with space between the chords for memory to live. People still passed by without looking. Some still dropped change without thinking. But others paused, if only for a moment, and listened, and that was enough. The girl with the red scarf returned once or twice that winter. She never said anything, and neither did I. But when our eyes met, I could see something in her expression, a kind of knowing, a kind of peace that reminded me of the first time someone believed in me without needing an explanation. That guitar of mine is still rough, still out of tune some mornings, still worn from the years it spent carrying everything I couldn't speak aloud. But now, every time I lift it, I feel something loosen in my chest, a weight exchanged for purpose, for memory, for presence. I play, not to forget anymore, but to remember rightly. I'm not the man I was when I first picked up that guitar on the sidewalk outside Union Station. I'm not the soldier frozen in time, hiding behind broken strings and unanswered letters. I'm not the boy Clara once kissed on the train platform, full of promises he didn't know how to keep. I am what remains, and what remains, if we are lucky, can still be enough. Sometimes people ask about the letter, and sometimes they don't. Either way, I let them see it. Some nod, some cry, some leave change, and whisper a thank you like they understand what they don't need explained. And sometimes that's all we get in this world. A single glance, a note in the cold, a quiet understanding that we've all survived something we weren't prepared for. So I play. I play because a little boy named David once drew a picture of a father he never met. I play because a woman named Clara chose not to ask why, but instead offered her hand. I play because a letter once carried me through the worst parts of myself, and when it finally escaped its hiding place, it didn't condemn me, it saved me. And now, I play because there's someone out there, standing in the cold, holding a memory in their chest, wondering if they'll ever be whole again. Maybe they won't find their letter, maybe their song is still unfinished. But maybe, just maybe, if they hear a note drifting out from the station, they'll know they're not alone. If this story moved you the way it moved me to write it, please like and subscribe. We share true stories every day, stories that heal, connect, and inspire.